Okay, so this is going to be a quick rundown of how do we close recessionary and inflationary gaps using the classical approach, think Hayek, and using the Keynesian approach, think Keynes. So in fact, why don't we just do this? We'll say Hayek right here. So, okay, so first situation that can happen is the AD curve, for whatever reason, shifts left. Now, typical among these is a loss of wealth amongst enough people that they feel it. Another possibility is this consumer confidence falls. So, for whatever reason, we're now in a recessionary gap. So, how would a classical economist fix this problem? Well, okay, so we know we went from point A to point B. The classical economic approach says that in the long run, wages are flexible, and that at point B, with increasing levels of cyclical unemployment, employees will not ask for as much money. Firms can take advantage of that by offering lower wages, which will be accepted, and therefore it cuts down on the cost of producing goods and services. The short run aggregate supply curve will shift right in response. So now we're at SRAS 1 at point C, and we're back to a long run equilibrium. So we went from point A to point B and from point B to point C without using government intervention. This is government hands off, let the economy fix itself. And it will do that because of, according to Hayek, flexible wages. Okay, so that's scenario one, which is, we're going to call AD left. Now, scenario two is going to be AD shifts to the right. So in this scenario, we're going to say that we go from point A to point B, and that AD has shifted to the right, like so. In this scenario, what we're going to find, according to Hayek, is that wages will increase because of we're beyond full employment. It's going to be very difficult to find new workers. Employees will feel that, and wages will increase. In fact, firms may begin poaching employees from other firms, which will certainly or should cause increasing wage levels. The result of that is that it becomes more expensive for firms to operate, and the SRAS curve, I'm just going to expand this a little bit, SRAS curve will shift to the right, and we go from point B to point C. Now, keep in mind, we're back at full employment at full employment levels. So we're back to long-run equilibrium at point C with higher price levels. And this I will call AD right. Okay, now these next two scenarios using the classical approach are a little more challenging for us. Because they involve shifting the SRAS curve. But let's see what happens here. So the third scenario, I'm going to call SRAS right. This is the easier of the two cases to talk about when the SRAS curve shifts. So here we're saying that we can, for whatever reason, we're able to produce more stuff at lower prices. This is the American dream. We've moved from point A to point B. Now, what will happen next? If the shift of the SRAS curve becomes permanent, then what we'll expect to see is that long-run aggregate supply will shift right as well, and we have a new full employment level of output. If it's not permanent, then the SRAS will just shift back left. But typically with supply shifts right, more often than not, LRAS will follow up and we'll end up with new levels of output. And that's usually based on increasing levels of productivity, whether through technology or better workers. Okay, fourth classical theory, and this is, or classical shift, and this is the hardest, is SRAS left. Now, in this scenario, what we get is SRAS shifts to the left, and what's important to see here is, let me just blow this up a little bit too. We've gone from point A to point B, and notice that at point B we've got a higher price level. We went from PL1 to PL2, and higher levels of unemployment. As we shift from YF to Y1, we're getting closer to zero. So we've got high levels of unemployment and high levels of inflation. This is the most difficult economic problem to solve, whether you're a Keynesian or a classical economist. This is difficult. So what do we think can happen here? Well, one possibility is that if it holds in the long run, then we simply see LRAS shift left, and we would have a new long run equilibrium at Y1. That's one possibility. I'm not going to draw that in, but you can imagine that. Another possibility under the classical theory is that we sort of go back to our first scenario. We've got a recessionary gap. We've got employees who are looking for work and don't have it. It's possible that that wages are flexible enough they fall. SRAS shifts back to the right. So really, those are our two scenarios under the classical theory. And again, not very satisfying. It doesn't seem like a good way to resolve. So this scenario, SRAS left, is the most difficult. Okay, let's go on to Keynesian. Let me scroll. Whoops. Oh, what the heck? Let's scroll down here. Nope. Something. Okay, hold on. Okay, so here's our Keynesian models. Okay, so here's the Keynesian models, and we've got in our first scenario, we're going to say we end up with a recessionary gap. We're going to call this AD left. And to fix this under Keynesian, now this is where government does get involved, and they get involved in two ways: fiscal and monetary. So I'm going to write these down like so. And fiscal, remember, is government. It's Congress and the president acting. Monetary is the Federal Reserve Bank acting. So obviously with this recessionary gap, we're producing at less than full employment. Remember, we're closer to zero. We want to get the economy moving again. According to Keynesian philosophy, we would increase spending for fiscal policy, decrease taxes, and we would expect some help from automatic stabilizers. Those are the fiscal tools that we have available. For monetary policy, we have four tools available. We can decrease the reserve requirement. We can decrease the discount rate. We can decrease, and I'm just going to put IOER, interest on excess reserves. And finally, we can buy bonds. So these are the four tools that we have available to us. So we can lower the reserve requirement, which honestly the Fed hasn't done since the early 1990s. We can lower the discount rate, which has an indirect effect on the federal funds rate and would tend to cause interest rates to fall, which should stimulate interest sensitive purchases of investment and consumption. We can lower interest on excess reserves, which will incentivize banks to lend out more money at lower rates. And we can buy bonds, which will arguably put more money into the economy. So those are the tools that we have available to us under Keynesian philosophy with a recessionary gap, AD-related recessionary gap. Okay, let's do next an inflationary gap. We go from AD to 81, from point A to point B. So this is AD right. And notice a couple things. We now are beyond full employment. We're at Y1, and we're going to be experiencing inflation. So we want to use contractionary policy here. And our contractionary fiscal policy is going to be to lower spending, to raise taxes, and allow automatic stabilizers to soften the blow as well. For the, just slide this a little bit over. So for monetary policy, what we should see is raising the reserve requirement. I'm just going to put RR, raising the discount rate, raising interest on excess reserves, and selling bonds. And the idea here is that we make money more expensive, money's taken out of the system, we cool it down, and by sort of cooling things down, AD shifts left because of reductions, particularly in consumption and investment. So that's the AD right scenario and the Keynesian response. Now let's do SRAS right. So with this, what we're seeing is a shift. So we're beyond full employment. We're at Y1. This is an interesting one, though, because we've got lower price levels. This scenario this is where it gets tricky for the Fed, because we want to see increasing levels of productivity. We like to see more goods and services, but at the same time, this situation can lead to inflation because we're beyond full employment. So the Fed will tend to use the same slowdown tools that they used for AD going to the right. So, and keep in mind, we went from A to B here. So, yeah, so the Fed's probably going to be looking at using the same tools that they would use when AD goes right. Okay, so our final scenario, and this is the most difficult again, just like it was for the classical theory, is when SRAS goes left. So we went from point A to point B. Notice we have a higher price level and higher and lower employment, or higher unemployment. So like this. So we've got a recessionary gap, but with the caveat that we've got inflation. So this is SRAS right. Now, this has happened. The best example we have of this was in the 1970s, following a decade or so of probably some fiscal mismanagement. We had price controls under Nixon, and some monetary mismanagement. I think the Nixon presidency put enough pressure on the Fed, and this had happened in the Johnson presidency too, that the Fed had responded with lower levels of interest and allowed the economy to run a little bit. It got too hot. So it was a mix of problems, but so here's how the Fed solved the problem. First, they attacked inflation. So to attack inflation, we would use typically contractionary monetary and fiscal policy that we see here. The result was that we had extraordinarily high unemployment. But eventually, and by attacking inflation, I mean the federal funds rate was in the teens, I mean it wasn't uncommon at all to see, housing, lenders charging in the over 20% for housing. Nowadays, you can get a mortgage for, I don't know, 4 or 5% or even less. Okay, then the second, so after inflation is eliminated, then attack the unemployment problem. And this is, in fact, what the Fed did. So then they engaged in expansionary policy. They lowered the federal funds rate back down, encouraged borrowing, which was done in the form of interest-sensitive investment and consumption, and we ended up back at long-run equilibrium. So there's your four scenarios. Oh, and so for number two, let me just do it. I'll use a different color. Looks like this. Okay. So those are the four sort of economic scenarios, and the classical response and the Keynesian response. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have questions, please let me know.